All right, now that we've learned a little bit about what the Supreme Court does, let's visit them in their building. This book is called The U.S. Supreme Court, and it's written by Anastasia Suen and illustrated by Matthew Skeens. My name is Marta. I'm a lawyer. I've come to the U.S. Supreme Court to talk about my case. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. Its building is a symbol of the country's highest law. 9 judges. Today's U.S. Supreme Court is made of 9 judges called justices. The justice's job is to make sure the words of the U.S. Constitution are followed. One justice is the Chief Justice. Supreme Court justices are picked by the president and approved by the Senate, a part of Congress. They serve until they retire, quit, are asked to leave, or die. The Judicial Branch. The U.S. government is divided into 3 parts or branches: judicial, legislative, and executive. The judicial branch is the court system. It makes sure the laws are carried out in the right way. The Supreme Court is part of the judicial branch. Each branch of the U.S. government has different powers, but no one branch is stronger than the others. Each branch is equal. On the move. The Supreme Court is located in the nation's capital. When the United States was new, the capital and the Supreme Court moved a lot. First, the court met in the Royal Exchange Building in New York City. In 1790, the U.S. government moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court moved along with it. While in Philadelphia, the U.S. Supreme Court met in 2 different buildings: Independence Hall and then City Hall. Sharing a building. In 1800, the U.S. government moved to Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court followed. It shared the Capitol building with Congress, using a number of different rooms. From 1860 to 1935, the court met in the old Senate chamber. After the British set fire to the U.S. Capitol during the War of 1812, the Supreme Court met in a private house for a short time. A home of its own. In 1929, Chief Justice William Howard Taft wanted the Supreme Court to have a home of its own. Congress agreed. Soon, plans for the Supreme Court building began to take shape. Work began in 1932. Taft held 2 top jobs in the United States. He was president from 1909 to 1913. He later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. An architect. Taft asked Cass Gilbert to design the U.S. Supreme Court building. Gilbert had designed the capitals for Minnesota, West Virginia, and Arkansas. He also designed other famous buildings. Gilbert designed the Supreme Court building to match other buildings in the capital city. Cass Gilbert designed the Woolworth Building in New York City. In 1913, it was the tallest skyscraper in the world. The Supreme Court building. 3 years later, in 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court building was completed. Almost square, the building measures 385 feet from front to back and 304 feet side to side. Its walls, floors, columns, and sculptures are made of marble from around the world. 16 columns stand at the main entrance to the U.S. Supreme Court building. Above the columns are the words, "Equal Justice Under Law." A look inside. Just inside the main entrance lies the Great Hall. Marble columns and busts of former Chief Justices line the walls. Offices fill most of the Supreme Court building's main floor and second floor. The 3rd floor is the Supreme Court Library. It holds more than 500,000 law books. Justices and staff members use these books for research. The bronze doors at the main entrance to the U.S. Supreme Court building weigh 6.5 tons each. They don't swing out when they open, they slide into the wall. The court chamber. The Supreme Court meets to hear cases in the court chamber. Seats in the chamber are painted red or black. The red benches on the left are for the media, or the newspapers and the news outlets. The red benches on the right are for guests. The black chairs in front of the benches are for officers of the court and important visitors. About 8,000 cases are submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court each year. Only about 100 to 150 are heard. The U.S. Supreme Court justices hear cases from October to May. They discuss the facts with one another and then make a decision. Once the court's decision is read, it cannot be changed. Maybe one day you can work inside this important American symbol as a lawyer or a judge. Here are Supreme Court facts. President George Washington picked John Jay from 1745 to 1829 to be the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Because there is an uneven number or an odd number of judges on the U.S. Supreme Court, there can never be a tie. The outside walls of the U.S. Supreme Court building are made of marble from Vermont. It took 1,000 freight train cars to carry the stone to Washington, D.C. In 2003, work began to make the Supreme Court building bigger. A 2-story underground addition was built for the court police. The court police keep everyone in the building safe. The Supreme Court building has more than 1 million visitors each year. Its cafeteria is open to the public and is known for its good food and fair prices. Before we finish, I just want to show you a couple of real pictures. Those are great illustrations in the book, but they still don't beat real pictures of the Supreme Court building. So here is the building itself. That's where you would walk in. You would go in and take a look. This is the main chamber where the Supreme Court hears the cases. You can see those black and red benches and chairs. Here we have those bronze doors that they talked about in the book. Those are definitely super heavy. And finally, if you remember back to Marshall the Courthouse Mouse, we were looking for turtles in the book. Here are just a few of the turtles you might find in the Supreme Court building and actually outside. The lampposts that are outside have turtles at the base. Now, think about it. If those lampposts are green and they've been outside in the weather, what material do you think they're made of? Think way back to the Statue of Liberty. If you said copper, you're right. At the bottom, you see that section that's right above all those columns. And I want you to notice, it's kind of hard to see on the full picture, so I have some zoomed in shots. They have the tortoise and the hare. And if you've ever heard that story about the tortoise and the hare having a race where they're trying to get to the end and the tortoise takes it slow and steady, that's where that whole idea of tortoises come from. And they even put that right up there in the top above the words and the door to the Supreme Court building.